Hi, everybody. It's your co-host here from Supply Chain Secrets, Don Davis, just giving you an intro to the show. So we've took a little break there over the holiday season, but now we're back and better than ever and recording shows. So you'll find that we'll be producing content on a regular basis as usual. So you have that to look forward to. And today we kick off the year with a pretty exciting show, in my opinion. We talked to Lee Kindberg, who is the head of environment and sustainability at Maersk. And we talked a little bit about her background, and then we started to get into an overview on the importance to decarbonize. And I think she gave some interesting insights there. Then we talked a lot about the IMO and their background. I don't know how familiar people are with what the IMO is and how they work, but Lee was able to shed some light on that, and that I thought was pretty terrific. And then we talked a little bit about some of the requirements in that are upcoming. There's a requirement in 2023 that many of you have probably heard of. There's also a target of 2050 and to be carbon neutral by 2050. So Lee talked about those requirements and a little bit about their impact, and I thought her insights were interesting. You might have seen in the press that Maersk has made some announcements on the environment and their targets within the next few years. And so Lee was able to talk about that and some of the things that they're doing. We talked a little bit more about biofuels and different types of fuel and some of the alternatives that are out there. Then we finally talked about shippers and their impact and how can shippers make an impact on a carrier if this is something that they think is important. And then finally, we let Lee play podcaster, and she did a great job asking Brian and I a very interesting question. So that was a lot of fun. But I think you'll like the show. Glad to be back. Excited for 2022. Think it's going to be an awesome year. Don't forget, give us feedback on the show. We love to hear from you. And yeah, give this one a listen. I think you'll like it. So we'll hear from us again soon. Thanks.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX. I'm former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. It's hard to believe it, but here we are in a new year, 2022. And it's great to be back with all of you. Well, hey there, Don. Happy New Year, my friend. Did you have a nice holiday?
I did, Brian. Thank you. And looking forward to starting off 2022 with a great show. Really excited about our guest today. And we took a little break there over the holiday, but now we're back and better than ever and looking forward to providing content on a weekly basis.
No, totally agree with you. It's awesome to be back again with you as well. It's hard to believe that we recorded, I think, almost 30 shows last year, and just the support and feedback from the listeners was just unbelievable. The cool thing, if you haven't listened to the show before, much of our content is actually listener driven. In other words, we try to give perspectives and thoughts based on the things that are important to you and may actually help your daily operations. And many times we get the chance to invite guests to come on with us that certainly have a particular expertise in certain subject matters. And I tell you what, that's the case today. So several of you have been asking about how future environmental sustainability initiatives may drive shipper and carrier behaviors in the coming years. And today we have an incredible guest to come on with us who may help us understand where all this might be heading. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Lee Kindberg. She is the head of environmental sustainability for Maersk in North America. She heads compliance, environmental initiatives, customer partnering on sustainability, and stakeholder outreach. She serves on the Marine Board of the National Academies of Science and Environment. She also has served for 6 years on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee and chaired the EPA Ports Work Group in 2014 through 2016. She's also an active Clean Cargo member, and she's dedicated to assessing and improving environmental impact of shipping. Lee, Happy New Year and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It sounds like you have some fun.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. We try and educate and have fun along the way. And, you know, that last bit about your bio being part of the Clean Cargo group is really where our relationship started. You,
Yep.
of course, were with Maersk, and at the time I was with Walmart, and We were both had environmental ambitions of improving the industry and working together, and that was a lot of fun.
It really was, and we really worked together. The strength of that organization was that it was half carriers and half shippers. And when you're sitting there looking at each other saying, "Well, I don't know how we can make that happen," and then a couple of your biggest customers say, "But we really need you to do this." All of a sudden the answer changes, doesn't it? And you find ways to do it.
Yeah, and to be able to work together on things that aren't competitive issues. So many times we as shippers and carriers are told you can't talk about these things because they're competitive issues, but it's so fun when there are issues that are common for all of us, and it's for good to be able to work together. And I know collaboration is a big part of your journey, and it'd just be great for the listeners to hear a bit about your feedback, or I mean your journey. It'd be great about to hear about your career and just where did your passion for sustainability come from?
Oh, gee. I think that's something that was always of interest to me, but I studied chemistry in college and have a PhD in chemistry. And so started out in laboratories in the chemical industry for a number of years, and then very quickly got involved in environment and safety through that laboratory work. And so I'd have to say that the majority of my career now has been in environment, health, and safety management. That's, of course, then grew into corporate citizenship, which then became called sustainability as definitions matured and that kind of thing. So I think, though, it really appeals to my need to save the world, or at least make it a better place.
Those are certainly pretty big ambitions, but thanks for sharing that.
Lee, I mean, first of all, it's great to have you on the show. You're our first doctor on the show, so that's really impressive, and your background is terrific. And if you could just maybe take a step back and just share your perspective on just the importance of sustainability for global supply chains and efforts to decarbonize. I think there's quite a bit happening. There's some IMO regulation that's coming out there for the future. I think there was some exciting news from Maersk this week on this topic. But just when you take a step back, can you start talking about, in a broader sense, the importance in some of the efforts that are underway?
Well, with globalization, global supply chains really contribute significantly to greenhouse gases that have led to our current climate crisis. And Brian brought up the Clean Cargo Working Group. We were really blessed with a number of customers who were really foresighted and realized almost 20 years ago now that we were going to have to, first of all, figure out how to measure this stuff and how to report it consistently across carriers. And then how do we start using that to start reducing that impact? So the great news is that that work started way back about '03, putting together that collaboration that was half carriers and half shippers, and now it also includes some freight forwarders and so forth, and coming up with how do you measure it consistently across now not just ocean, but also extending through the GLEC framework all the way from that loading dock, perhaps in Sri Lanka, all the way to the Walmart in Davenport, Iowa. And so it's been an interesting evolution. There are now standard methods for reporting those supply chains and not just looking at one particular piece of it, but coming up with ways to look at it more holistically so that you can say, if I do this route instead of that route, I can make these reductions. And considering environment and sustainability as one of those decision criteria, along with cost and time and the other reliability, those other normal procurement factors.
And what's your sense on that? I mean, it's great that we can now measure this, right? I think that's really an important piece. And what's your impression on the willingness to adopt a standard? Do you feel like that's been contentious? Has it been smooth? Has there one region, part of the world that says, "Oh, I don't like this one"? I mean, what's your perspective on how it's measured and the adoption within the industry?
Well, these days, over 85% of the container ship globally report into Clean Cargo's annual environmental survey. So that says it really is a true industry representation. And when you've got, again, big customers who look at you and say, you must be part of this or I won't do business with you. Again, that overcomes some of that initial reluctance. There have been some adjustments along the way where metrics could be improved because data was better, for example. But I'll tell you that, at least for us, using the Clean Cargo metrics, which we also use internally, we have reduced our carbon footprint per container per kilometer by 46% since 2008.
Wow.
That means it takes us about half the fuel to ship a box that it took us 12 years ago. And other clean cargo members also have bragging rights of those kinds of reductions. So this is not something that just made a 5% improvement or those kinds of things. This has really cut the fuel used by a third to a half across the industry. And so, those initial meetings where we were all looking at each other saying, gosh, how would we do that? It's amazing how this has really changed our ability to do this. Now IMO, of course, is trying to figure out how do you do it for all shipping, not just containers, but ro-ros and bulkers and tankers. How do you do it across the entire marine industry? Because we're a big part of the global greenhouse gas issue. And so we have to be part of the solution.
I mean, Lee, the results are incredible. To think that those small meetings that we had, like you said, almost 20 years ago, that really weren't being pushed necessarily by any regulation. It's just because it was a group of involved stakeholders that had an interest in doing something collectively for good, as you say, and trying to be a small part of maybe changing the trajectory of things. But now you've introduced kind of this idea of IMO, and I know a lot of people hear IMO. I know they hear certain guidelines or certain expectations that come from IMO. It'd be great if you could just explain a little bit broader about the role the IMO plays, and then some of these benchmarks or some of these targets that have been placed out there and how that fits also into this whole initiative.
Okay, well let's lay a little bit of groundwork first in case some of the listeners aren't familiar with IMO. That's the International Maritime Organization, and it's actually an agency under the United Nations that's tasked with setting the rules for global shipping. Because the only way you can do that effectively is on a global basis and not country by country. But the participants at IMO and those who vote at IMO are countries. So there is a treaty underneath IMO. Everybody refers to it as MARPOL, but it's a treaty that was set up to prevent and reduce pollution from shipping. And so it sets criteria, for example, for sulfur in fuels, and it sets criteria for other things, ballast water and those kinds of things. But MARPOL is the big treaty, and as countries adopt the various provisions that IMO develops, then those countries actually help enforce the requirements. So that's sort of the basis of who IMO is. Now, in the last few years, shipping is really the only industry that's actually established goals for the global industry to do greenhouse gas reductions. And it's been quite a haggle, as you might guess, with many different kinds of ships out there and many different countries sitting at the table. How do you come up with the right metrics? Because when we were doing clean cargo, we had the luxury of time. We had the luxury of not being bogged down by regulation, which can add a lot of baggage. And we were able to find that balance between practicality and technical accuracy. But when IMO puts something together, it then enters into force as a regulation and will be enforced. So you've got to get it right. And so what IMO often does is it'll establish something and then it will tighten it down and it will refine the definitions and tighten it down and refine the definitions so that you have an ever improving process, like stepping down the fuel sulfur over a number of years so that the fuel got cleaner and cleaner and the refineries had time to make their investments so the fuel could comply and those kinds of things. That's where we are right now on the greenhouse gas thing. We've got global numerical targets across the industry for decarbonization. And to my knowledge, this is the only industry that has that. And now the haggling that's going on is they've established some metrics, and of course, they're acronyms. There's an EEDI for new ships, an Energy Efficiency Design Index. There is an EEXI, which is an energy efficiency metric for existing ships. And then there's a CII, which is a carbon intensity measure. And then there's an SEEMP, which is, let's see, something about a ship energy efficiency management plan. So as you can see, there are all kinds of tools that are being developed and they're now being fleshed out and put into place. So that they started with the new ships and now they're working at how do we actually measure it correctly and fairly across all different ships. And they're talking about ships actually having a score or a rating of from A through E of how energy efficient and therefore environmentally friendly is each vessel.
Yeah, I've heard about that, and that's part of the I think the 2023 requirement. But before I go into the 2023 specifics, I think what would be helpful is for our listeners to understand a little bit more around some of these requirements, because I think we just referred to the IMO 2023. I think there's an IMO 2050. There's different types of requirements, and for me, if I'm a supply chain manager or if I'm someone on the commercial side at an ocean carrier, what should I understand? What should be my key takeaways about what's happening in the short term and the long term and the impact on each of those stakeholders from a carrier perspective, but also from a shipper perspective?
Well, first of all, I would say you need to join Clean Cargo because one of the real benefits of being part of Clean Cargo is getting briefings on how that's evolving from people who are actually sitting at the table. But other collaborations like that can also be really terrific resources in terms of understanding what's coming and how's it going to impact you and when. Because if you just read the press, you can sometimes feel that, oh no, I've got to do something about this right now. Whereas some of these are midterm measures, some of them are long term measures. And so you need to be asking your carriers, what are you doing about this?
Yeah, and I think a confusing part, if I'm just looking at the media, is that some of these seem like they're voluntary, some feel like companies are just being proactive, and some are just hard implementation. So when we had the IMO 2020, and then there was this, low sulfur fuel requirement, and then carriers are getting scrubbers, and then there's low sulfur fuel, and then carriers have a variety of indices to measure the cost. I think it's confusing for a lot of people, and maybe they're not prepared for it. Do you see anything like that coming in the near term as a result of some of these requirements, the change that we saw in 2020? Any similar impacts?
I see pressure both from the IMO side, but even much more from the shipper side to make dramatic improvements in energy efficiency and reduce greenhouse gases. So you may have seen the COSEV announcement, for example, ZEV, which is Companies for Zero Emissions Vessels, I think, made up of some major global cargo owners who were demanding zero carbon shipping by 2040. And that was actually published, I think, around October, right before COP26. But I think I got away from your question. If you want to remind me of where I'm supposed to be going with this question.
Well, I was wondering, I mean, first of all, if you foresaw any impact like you saw with IMO 2020, but also like just any short and long-term impacts, because I think for a lot of people, what you see in the press is confusing because you see some carriers being very proactive and they're talking about different things they're doing. Then you see these things that are just hard and fast regulations like IMO 2020, low sulfur fuel, that was a requirement. So some things are voluntary and some things are mandated. And I think for if I'm an individual, I just kind of want to try and understand like, wow, I might have felt like IMO 2020 had an impact that I didn't really anticipate because maybe I heard about low sulfur fuel, but I wasn't expecting all these confusing formulas from different carriers and things that work differently. And now I think people have adjusted that, got sorted out. But is there anything on the horizon that would be similar to that if I'm a supply chain manager, I'm on the commercial side, should I be aware of any of that type of impact, or how do you see this unfolding as these requirements are implemented and the effect on me from a supply chain perspective or from a carrier perspective?
Well, looking at it from an intermediate to long term basis, energy efficiency has gotten us a long way. As I mentioned, our 46%, and other carriers have other similar bragging rights. But you can only go so far with energy efficiency. You can't get to zero. To get to zero, you've got to do something new and different. And so we are all going to be investing in future fuels is one of the major things that's being looked at. IMO is also talking about speed constraints. So I would say be aware of what are the things that might be considered so you're not caught by surprise.
Lee, I'd love to dive in a bit deeper there. I think some people with the release of this podcast may think there's some bit of a coincidence with some of the recent announcements of your current company, Maersk. But the reality is we've been trying to schedule you for a couple of months, and it just so happens that it's kind of coming. The podcast will release about the same time as the announcements from Maersk. But I'd love for you to talk about some of those other initiatives you're talking about. There were some really cool things I saw on ship design and these other strategies that you'll have to take, to your point, to get to zero beyond just kind of energy and fuel. But please share some of the exciting news with us.
Well, yeah, thank you. Let me take you back to December of 2018 when Maersk announced that we were going to get to zero carbon shipping by 2050 and that we didn't know how we were going to get there. And we invited collaboration not only from customers, but also researchers and many others around the world. And we put together an organization and started working on it to try to clear the fog, figure out which fuels seemed to be the best, most practical candidates for us, and feasible technically, economically, scalability. We use a lot of fuel. It can't just be some little something. So there are many different factors that go into that. Early in 2021, we announced that we were going to launch our first zero carbon vessel, a small feeder, about 2,000 TEU, that would operate in the Baltics and Northern Europe. And it would operate on green methanol. So methyl alcohol instead of a petroleum fuel, and it'll be made either from renewable fuels and biomass or be purely a biofuel. And we've contracted for the fuel for that one. So methanol is a very common industrial chemical. We know how to store it. We know how to pump it around. We know how to use it. There are even actually marine engines out there for methanol tankers that were already built to burn methanol, to operate on methanol. And those engines don't care whether the methanol was made in a standard way or whether it was made in a green way. So that suddenly reduces some of the risk by saying this is an engine that's actually in operation. We just have to make it bigger and we have to put it into a container vessel. So we are launching that vessel and we committed to launch it by 2023, which at the time a lot of us sort of gulped because that was 7 years earlier than the original commitment. And then later in the year, we announced that we were going to build 8 what they call mother vessels, 16,000 TEU vessels, the kinds that would be on, say, a Trans-Pacific route. And we would launch those in 2024. And we just announced that we're going to take not just 8, but 12 of them. And they will also operate on green methanol. Now, we all know that transitions of this magnitude don't happen without glitches. So these vessels will be built as dual fuel vessels. They'll have the capability, if the green fuel is not available in a particular port yet or something like that, to also operate on marine gas oil. So standard fuels, because reliability, of course, is extremely important. But the idea is that these vessels will get very quickly to the point that they're operating 100% on the new green fuels and therefore will have basically eliminated their carbon footprint on a tank to wake basis. So it's all biofuel. Now, maybe I ought to digress a little bit if you will humor me and say,
Please.
okay, why are biofuels zero carbon? If you think about it, when you use a fuel that's made out of fossil fuels, you're taking CO2 or carbon compounds out of the ground and you're turning it into CO2 and putting new CO2 into the atmosphere that was never there before. So you're increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The same would be true of any other fossil fuel that you took out of the ground, like natural gas. When you grow a plant, it takes CO2 out of the atmosphere to grow the plant, the tree, or the agricultural crop. And then you take that and convert it into a fuel, and the CO2 gets used back into the atmosphere. So that's short cycle carbon. It's not putting new carbon into the atmosphere, it's taking it out and putting it back in, and taking it out and putting it back in. So biofuels are considered to be net zero carbon that way. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation, and thank you for taking the time to explain it because I think that's pretty interesting for our listeners. And would you say, I mean, I think there's a few of these different kind of fuel alternatives, these biofuels that are out there. And do you see that there's one that the pros far outweigh any cons? I don't know if there'd be any cons actually, other than maybe cost. But do you see that one is just kind of jumps off the page and say like this is the direction we need to go? Because I think from a media standpoint, it feels like there's been like debate because there's been like LNG. Some companies seem to be betting on LNG, and then I wonder to myself, well, is LNG bad and these biofuels are better? Is there a cost implication? But how would you look at that in terms of is there a pro, and does that pro come with a significant cost implication, or is it cost neutral, or is it relatively the same, or how do you see
At
it?
this point, all of these new fuels are more expensive. Fortunately, when you spread it over the number of items that are in a container and the number of containers that are on a ship, the numbers are not huge. But there is an additional cost at least today. We certainly, as we scale things, would hope to bring the cost down. But if you talk about different types of fuels that might fit in these categories, we think there are going to be more than one winner.
Oh,
There are
good.
a number of companies that have made a commitment to liquefied natural gas or LNG, which does reduce greenhouse gases 15% or so versus standard bunker fuel. Now, then, if you can go to, say, a bio LNG or a renewable LNG, then you can get another significant reduction. But you will have learned how to do so on fuel that was commonly available. So, some companies have taken that strategy that they will build bio LNG vessels and then work to get more renewable or greener LNG. And that's a valid strategy. For us, we have made a bet on jumping directly to the low carbon fuels and not going through that fossil fuel stage. And so we're making our bet on green methanol, which is methyl alcohol. Both of those, one's methane, the other is methanol. They both contain some carbon. But again, we're talking once you get to the renewable stage, short cycle carbon. So we're not adding new CO2 or greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And there's an analysis called life cycle assessment that looks at the energy required and the emissions all the way from the production of the fuel, whether it's from a well or from a field or something, all the way to delivery, then into the vessel, into the engine, and then turning the propeller to make the wake. So we call that well to wake. That analysis is really important because if you only look at tank to wake, you might be ignoring an important piece of it. And so some of the factors that they look at is the greenhouse gas, the global warming potential of, for example, methane, which is natural gas, is much higher than the global warming potential of CO2. So if you've got leakage of methane, then that's a problem because you're increasing your global warming impact much more than you would if you were just creating CO2. So that life cycle assessment is one of the things IMO is working on, is how do you incorporate that into all of these metrics. But again, we think there'll be multiple pathways and there are multiple strategies that hopefully we can all work together and find a few that really work, and we can get the infrastructures and so forth in place to make it happen.
I think it's really fascinating because I think this also impacts the order book, right? That's what I understood is that when you're thinking about building new ships, and some might say like, hey, just build new ships, but if you ignore any sort of infrastructure issue and just say build more ships and everything would be fine. But part of it is this whole fuel direction, right? Like what is the fuel going to be for the future? Because normally ships have a certain type of lifespan, and if you choose something that's going to be obsolete in, let's say, 10 years, well, that's a pretty expensive mistake you might have made on acquiring a ship that just doesn't have
hmm
the same lifespan. But
That's
I
a
want
good point. If I could just make a point
go
about
ahead.
that. Suppose you've made a commitment to be zero carbon by 2050. And a lot of the IMO goals and so forth hit 2050s. A lot of the other goals that are out there hit 2050. The lifespan of a vessel is 20 to 25 years. So you do the math. This has to be the decade of action. We need to start launching vessels this decade because they'll still be on the water in 2050.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's something that people have to understand. And I was going to circle back to that IMO 2023 because we just touched on it, but there's something coming in 2023. You had referred to it that there's this rating scale that goes somewhere between A to E, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
And these ships that are classified as a D or an E, those are the ones that have to either have a corrective action or they can't operate on the water. And I think a D has 3 years to do that, and an E has 1 year to do that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know a very, very high level of what's happening there, but could you talk a little bit more about that? And also, do you foresee an impact in 2023, or would the impact really be in 2024, given the requirement, or how do you see the effect of those requirements in 2023?
Well, it's going to take a couple of years of getting data to really, I think you have to have a certain rating for a couple of years before you actually have to take action. And then there are multiple actions that you can take. But, a lot of this is still being debated, and there's a meeting every month at IMO from this month all the way through June, I believe. So there's still a lot of work going on in terms of exactly how you nail down all of those requirements. So rather than diving into the details of where we think it is now, let me also mention an unintended consequence you can run into.
Sure.
Because one of the measures you can take to reduce fuel consumption in a vessel is to slow it down. But let's think about what happens if you slow it down. If that cargo is going to now take 35 days instead of 30 days to get from where it was produced to where it's needed, are some of those shippers going to consider moving that cargo to air freight, which has 50 to 70 times the carbon impact? So if you think about it, you have to be very careful about unintended consequences here. And since IMO is focused only on the maritime side of it, but there can be leakage or transfer to other modes that could have bigger impacts. And so that's why they're taking time and care to try to get these things right.
No, that makes sense. But I understood there was a carbon tax at some point as well, right? There was going to be a carbon calculator, and then based on the amount of carbon that your shipment produces, there's a tax on that. Do I understand that right? And do you
It's
have any
it's been
more?
proposed. Right now, where would the authority come from to actually implement a global carbon tax?
That's a good question. I don't
That's,
I don't really know.
that's one of the real challenges. I
Mhm.
suspect here in the United States, we might have discomfort from a global organization saying we're going to tax you. So I am not aware of a specific tax that is in place today. Now, a lot's going on in Europe. So, for example, vessels are being pulled into the European trading system, which is a cap and trade program. And so, those fuels, right now, we have to report the data. Going forward, they'll actually have to buy and sell credits, which will have the effect of what we call a market based measure. In other words, making the fuels that you don't want to be used more expensive, which hopefully then gives you more of an incentive to move to these cleaner modes of transportation, whether they be clean fuels or maybe batteries or fuel cells or some gee whiz new technology that hopefully somebody's out there working on right now.
So all that's absolutely fascinating and will be really interesting to follow and see how it develops. Lee, I want to bring it back to kind of the shipper side. We started the conversation about the collaboration between shippers and carriers. You've talked a bit about some of these public declarations by shippers. I just wonder how important, the shipper component is to this. It'd be great for shippers to hear kind of carrier perspective, the public declarations. If shippers start to consider some of these initiatives as part of their procurement decisions in the future, continuing to work together, I just wonder if you could share the importance or how shippers play a role in helping push these initiatives forward.
Your customers' demands are probably the number one thing that your CEO listens to. If you think about it, that demand signal from the customers is so important. So I remember several years ago when a couple of members of Clean Cargo said, we're actually going to start incorporating your CO2 scores in Clean Cargo into our procurement decision making. And all of a sudden, that got a lot of attention and a lot of priority. And they also said, and we want, by the way, that to be third party verified data. And that's what led to Clean Cargo data now all being third party verified. So it's auditable. And so you can count on that data. As we move forward into it, a few of us have green products. For example, we have a biofuel based product called Eco Delivery, where you can actually, it's like buying green electricity. You can ship some containers and say, okay, I want these 100 containers moved zero carbon. And we go out and we buy biofuel, which is only available in a few places in the world on the marine side, and we'll burn it in one of our big high efficiency Triple E ships. And then we'll credit those CO2 savings back to the company that shipped with that eco delivery product. Even if the boxes weren't on that exact ship, they caused the fuel to be purchased. And it's a premium product. So, for the first time in the last 2 years, we actually see customers willing to pay more to ship zero carbon. You can imagine what attention that gets at the boardroom when you've got customers willing to first give you preference, second, actually pay more for this.
Yeah, that's great. I think it just underlines the importance of the environment to some companies, and
Hmm.
I think it's on everybody's mind. There's certainly a lot of discussion about it, so it's great to see that some companies are really leaning in and actively participating and taking on costs to do this. That's great. So something I like to ask people, and just to make predictions, and I ask Brian predictions all the time. Half the time they're not right, so there's no pressure here. But if you were to look into the future and really think like 40 years from now, right? So we're past the 2050 requirement. And is there anything that you would predict that you think might happen that maybe not everybody's thinking of right now, but based on what you're seeing, you could see a path that the industry changes that now they've adopted this, which is going to have a significant environmental impact?
I'm trying to think how many years ago it was that Malcolm McLean invented container shipping. You're asking a lot of my poor foggy little crystal ball to look out 40 years. I will say that I believe that there still will be some shipping. There still will be advantages to growing or manufacturing things in one part of the world and moving them to another part of the world. Some people say that 3D printing will replace all of that. I think there'll still be a need. Oranges don't grow in North Carolina, nor does coffee. So there still will be some needs for those things. How much of that happens and whether or not it still moves on the water and whether or not what fuels it moves with, I think we don't know yet, but I know it will have to be done with much lower impact and much more consideration of the environment. And that IMO is a mechanism for making some of that happen.
Yeah, well, that's good news that we can count on that. And I don't know, the 3D printer, Brian. I mean, my shirt's going to feel very, very rough with a 3D printer, I think. So I hope that that doesn't happen. But well, I think we're at a point in the show, Lee, where we like to turn it around. We've been peppering you with questions. You've done a great job answering them. I mean, really fascinating and great insights. But now it's your chance that you can ask either Brian and I a question. You're the podcast host now, and is there anything that's top of mind that you'd like to ask either one of us?
Oh my. Well, let me hand you my magic wand. Yes, it looks like a pen, but it's a magic wand. The recharger is only good for 3 wishes, okay? And they can only apply to business, by the way, it can't be personal wealth. So, what are each of you going to do with your 3 wishes for the industry?
Wow, that's a great question, and that's one that I would love to have hours to think on that because I mean the implication could be huge, and here I have to do it off the top of my head. So I'll take this first, Brian. Okay, I'll come up with three. I think first of all, particularly when it comes to the environment, I just I would wish that it was easier to implement these things for shippers to consume because I worked at a carrier when IMO 2020 was implemented, and I don't think anyone would argue with the principle that they want to help the environment. I think the frustrating thing for shippers were trying to understand that you had carriers on the same ship, but they had different formulas to calculate their bunker. And I understand that companies look at costs differently, but trying to explain that to some shippers was a challenge. And I think it just affects adoption. And I think if there was a way, and I know this is a tricky legal question because it's always like, oh, we don't want these carriers colluding. But I don't know if there was some independent body, or if the IMO could say, hey, we're going to create this calculator. Can you all agree? And it was collaborative or something, just something to help accelerate adoption. Two, I think I would wish that there was greater visibility of the impact that the way you choose to ship, the impact on the environment was very transparent, and it was very easy to see what kind of alternatives that you might have. So if you had the opportunity to barge versus truck, or take a short sea route, or if you had better visibility, I think companies would do it. And that's, I asked a question earlier about the standards and the measurement. I think that's great that we're starting to get there, because when somebody says, well, I reduced my emissions 15%, well, how exactly are you measuring it? If I say 15% and you say 15%, is that the same, or is it just my version of how I calculate it? So I wish there was better visibility, because I think companies would make decisions if it was just easy to consume. If I had an app on my iPhone that I could see like a list of my shipments, then I think it would go like that. But I'll contact Apple. And I guess finally, I would say that my wish would be that we would have some perspective or some ability to really know what the best decision is in terms of these biofuel and these choices. Because I think what I've seen, and just from my little podcast station over here, looking at what's happening, is I think carriers are thinking different directions. And I think my sense is carriers want the same thing. They want to protect the environment, but just the way they go about it is different. And, I think there's certain cost and business implications of this. And I just wish that wouldn't get in the way. I just wish we could just say this is the right decision and we knew. I mean, I realize this is a wish, so I can ask for this, even though I know it's impossible. But I would wish that we would just know that it's this, renewable type of fuel that we could all adopt, so we could just get on with it and start ordering ships and move forward in that direction. Because my sense is there's going to be some waste somewhere, and that may cause people to hold on to something which, if we knew then what we knew then at that point, if we knew it in the past, we might have made a different decision, which would have caused a smaller impact on the environment.
Mhm.
But those are my three wishes. Brian, you've had 5 minutes to think about this. I'm expecting you to improve every one of my wishes by 30%.
No. Hey, that was pretty good, to be honest with you. For me, it's broader strokes. I mean, my wish would just be for true kind of industry alignment, right? Lee, you talked about these groups that started small, the idea of coming up with some idea of a goal or an initiative, and then finding true collaboration again around something that really isn't necessarily a competitive issue. So if somehow the entire industry could align behind a specific, essentially moonshot goal, right? I know, Lee, Maersk and others have taken the lead to try and push the initiative, but I'd love for there to be just kind of one rallying point for the industry to everybody get behind, because I think amazing things happen when there is something very specific that everybody's aligned around. And then the second component is what Lee talked about, is kind of this cost, component. I think that for so long we've been stuck on one specific part of the cost equation, and many times it's the specific ocean freight, and it distracts from so many other things happening. To be quite honest with you, it's more of a short-term transactional approach to kind of business and costing. And Don, we've talked about this ability to kind of look at the total cost equation. Everything from kind of end to end in the supply chain. And Lee, you essentially said it. While there might be, a put and a take or an increase here or there, when it's spread across an entire contents of a container, or it's a spread across the entire supply chain, it might be negligible. It might stick out at any one particular place, but spread across it might be different. And then the other component is one of the things that was a tenet at Walmart is that, we weren't just doing sustainable initiatives just to do them. They actually, had to be good for business as well. So the idea of becoming more efficient, becoming more sustainable, and it actually being good for business, lowering overall cost, and then ultimately being able to serve or pass through, savings to your customers, I think is part of that virtuous cycle. So the costing piece. And then finally, Don, we've talked about this idea of moving past these shorter term transactional relationships, where it's so hard to create alignment across organizations. So this idea of moving to more of these strategic, longer term types of relationships, where you're not worried about, am I going to be doing business with this partner in 6 months from now or not? It's, oh no, there's a longer term commitment here for the underlying operational side of the business. And that's going to give us then the freedom to go out and work on some of these other initiatives that are so important. Once we take our attention away from, again, negotiating a new ocean freight rate every 6 to 12 months. So For me, I think those are certainly some of the things I'd love to see movement towards. And to be quite honest with you, the good thing is we're seeing movement in some of those, and the broader adoption, I think, is just really going to accelerate it.
So how do we do, Lee? How do we do on
Awesome.
our wishes? Hopefully they weren't wasted on us.
That was awesome.
Well, great. Well, listen, it's been a great show. Really enjoyed having you as a guest. I had a lot of fun and I learned a lot. I probably learned more in this show than I have on any other show. And that's no disrespect to any of our other guests. I think the subject matter is really interesting, and it's not a space I'm in all the time. I certainly know high level things, but it was really great. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun, as promised.
Well, and to our listeners, don't forget, rate us, review us wherever you find us on our podcast. And thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll have another show soon. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.